I want to emphasise something I've mentioned before, and that is that as socialists, our interest in economics is a practical one. I mean, it's not just an intellectual exercise. And productivity, the capacity to produce wealth, is a very practical issue indeed. Our idea of socialism is, the basic idea, is that it will operate on the basis of the principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which means that enough will be produced to make it possible for all people everywhere to have free access to goods and services. And this can only be done if there is a very big increase in the world and in the parts of the world in the total amount of goods and services that are produced. Quite apart from the millions of people in this country and in America and Europe generally, that's in the industrial advanced countries whose needs are not satisfied, there are hundreds of millions of people in the less developed countries living on and below the poverty line, so to speak. An International Labour Organization report a couple of years ago estimated that there are 1,500 million people in third world countries living, and I quote, in dire poverty, lacking basic needs of food, health, housing and education. 100 years ago, Marx looked at this question and said that capitalism does not produce enough to satisfy the wants of the great mass decently and humanely. And it's still true. Capitalism has never produced enough to meet the reasonable needs of the great mass of the world, of the whole of the world's population. Marx, by the way, warned against the error of supposing that the existence from time to time of unsold surpluses of lots of goods. He said, you mustn't think this means that too much is being produced to meet the needs of the world. As Marx put it, it is not a fact that too much wealth is produced, but it is true that there is periodical overproduction of wealth in the capitalist and self-contradictory form. He also made the point, by the way, that under capitalism, what is produced is often done by people who, and I quote, are compelled to perform certain kinds of labour which can be dignified with the name only under a miserable mode of production. So socialist society, in addition to greatly increasing the amount of useful goods and services for the needs of the world population, will also aim to get rid of drudgery, overwork and dangerous work, which may in many cases involve some loss of production. And obviously that's one of the things that socialist society will have to accept. Now, many socialists have brushed aside the problem of production as if it didn't exist. Some of them have disregarded Marx's warning and have mistakenly thought that the periodic existence of unsold surpluses proves that too much is already being produced. Although Marx warned them against it, you're dealing with two separate things there, but some of them have assumed that because from time to time there have been these big surpluses, that the problem of production has been solved. Others have enormously exaggerated existing powers of production and the rate at which it increases. Engels, for example, in 1844, without even attempting to prove it, announced a theory of his that powers of production increase at a geometric rate. That is to say that powers of production double themselves every few years and go on doubling themselves. I think Engels may have been misled by misreading the capacity of capitalism in a boom period to increase total output by a very large amount indeed. For example, in the years 1971 to 73, when the last not very long boom took place in this country, total production increased by 10%. But what you have to notice is that the main reason why British capitalism was able to increase total output by 10% in a couple of years was very largely the fact that it had an industrial reserve army of unemployed and took on another 400,000 or 500,000 workers. And you see, you can't do this, you can't go on doing this. If there's a reserve of unemployed, you can absorb 500,000 additional workers, and they can increase output. But the next year there aren't those the same industrial reserve army. You can't find another 500,000 workers every year. And as I say, Engels may have been misled by what he could see going on in the 1870s, when production increased very rapidly for a short period. But the main reason why many people have thought that powers of production go on increasing at what Engels called an unheard of rate is that they don't understand how to measure productivity and the way in which it increases. Marx himself, before he completed his studies, in other words, when he hadn't fully grasped the problem, accepted as if it was true a statement by Proudhon that between 1770 and 1840 each worker's output had been multiplied 27 times. Now, Proudhon made this statement, Marx accepted it, commented on it, but it simply wasn't true. Coming up to our own time, the Labour Party in 1950s or thereabouts published a pamphlet in which they claimed that in the previous 180 years each worker's output had been multiplied 1,000-fold. In other words, they're asking to believe that every worker in 1850 was producing 1,000 times as much as workers 180 years before. Now, this had a very ironic twist to it. Ernest Bevin, the trade union official, at that time was Foreign Secretary. And he made an appeal to the workers, and I think it was at the Trade Union Congress, begging them to increase their output by 10%. He said, look, if you'll only give me a 10% increase out of the output, when I go and meet these foreign governments, and Europe's desperately short of all sorts of materials, my hand will be enormously strengthened if I can say the British workers are producing 10% more. Well, workers who'd been told by the Labour Party that they were already producing 1,000 times as much as they had been 180 years before, might have gone to Bevin and said, look, as we're producing 1,000 times as much already, what difference is a piffling 10% going to make? And the answer is not that the 10% was wrong, but that the 1,000-fold was quite wrong. Now, all of these very exaggerated claims are, in fact, pure fantasy. The real increase between 1770 and 1840, it was possible that workers' output had doubled. And the real increase up to 1952 was not 1,000-fold, but perhaps 10-fold. Now, the man who was largely responsible for these wrong ideas held by economists and politicians about powers of production was Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations in 1776. Smith was making a quite valid point that division of labour and specialisation enable the worker to increase his output, his productivity. And he illustrated his argument by looking at the pin makers, the workers making pins. He asked his readers to consider first a pin-making establishment in which each man on his own went through all the processes of making a pin from start to finish, much as today you might consider a shoemaker working on his own who makes a pair of shoes from start to finish. And Adam Smith then contrasted that situation with a pin-making factory in which the process of pin-making was broken down into a series of separate stages, with each man or each team working on a separate stage of the pin so that no man any longer made a pin from start to finish. They all only made a bit of it. In our modern analogy, you would think not of a man on his own making a pair of shoes all by himself, but a shoe factory in which each worker or team of workers concentrates on one operation only, say cutting the uppers, making the sole, boring the lace holes, fastening the sole to the uppers, and so on. And Adam Smith's example of pin makers caught the imagination of everybody. I mean, the economists and everybody else. His story about the pin makers has been reproduced hundreds of times, and you'll still see it cropping up in modern textbooks on economics. Now, the truth is that for 200 years, they have all been misled by Adam Smith. Such was Smith's reputation that, as far as I know, no economist has ever taken a critical look at these pin makers and wondered if Adam Smith, in fact, got the thing right. Not that Smith was dishonest, it simply was that he himself had not understood the problem at the time. But it really is astounding that nobody has noticed the absurdity of Smith's own conclusion. Because what Smith tells you at the end of his description of pin making and contrasting the two methods, he says that such is the advantage of division of labour that it enables a pin maker to produce 240 times as many pins when he's working with division of labour as when he's working as his own. And then in the next sentence, after having told you it may be multiplied by 240, in his next sentence he tells you, in fact, it may have been multiplied by 4,800. Well, when cautious statisticians give you figures, they frequently say, there's a margin of error, but I've never known a statistician before whose margin of error stretched from 240 to 4,800. And the reason why Smith produced this curious conclusion was that he couldn't make up his mind whether, as he put it, one worker making a pin all on his own would be able to make 1 pin a day or 20 pins a day. So if he was only able to make 1 pin a day, then you multiply it by 4,800. If he made 20 pins a day, you multiply it by 240, you see. The fact is, of course, that Adam Smith was hopelessly wrong in 1776, and all the people who borrowed his story and gone on repeating it have been wrong ever since. And the odd thing is, as I say, that I don't know anybody who's ever challenged Smith on the point, and I can see why they don't challenge him, because in essence they still work on the same wrong idea that Adam Smith had. So where did Adam Smith go wrong? First, he was right to this extent that the division of labour does bring about a moderate increase in productivity. A team of 100 workers specialising in groups of 10 on separate operations will in fact produce more than if each of the 100 workers carried on the whole operation from beginning to end. I mean, that's a broad proposition that's generally true. Second, Adam Smith was on the right lines when he saw that you could measure productivity by the amount of labour required to produce something. In principle, it is quite correct to measure productivity by the amount of labour required to produce a given article. Or to put it the other way round, suppose in a week 10 men produce 100 articles, and then you get an improved organisation of production so that the same 10 men are able to raise their output from 100 to 120 articles in a week. That's an increase in productivity of 20% for each man. Each man, so to speak, is now producing 12 articles, where before each man was only producing 10. But where Adam Smith went wrong, and people are still going wrong today, was he didn't take into account the whole of the labour required to make pins. He only took into account a part of it. And it was Marx who solved the problem with his labour theory of value. Marx showed that the amount of labour required to produce a commodity is the amount of labour embodied in the finished article, and that it consists of two parts. Whether it's pins or shoes or motor cars or anything else, Marx says in the finished article, the total amount of labour embodied in it is in two parts. The second part is the labour of the workers in the pin factory or the shoe factory. The first part, or what Marx called the previous part, is the labour of the workers producing the materials, the machines, the buildings and all the rest of it, before you get to the pin factory or the shoe factory where they're actually making the shoes. Suppose, for example, that a shoe factory employs 1,000 workers on the production of shoes, and their labour is embodied in the shoes and constitutes part of the labour in the finished article, the shoes, but it is only a part. The other part, the previous part, is the labour embodied in the raw materials. In the case of shoes, the leather and tanning the leather and processing it in all sorts of ways, the tools, the machinery, the buildings, the oil and electricity used as fuel and all the rest of it that goes in as part of the equipment of a shoe factory. Now, the first labour, the previous labour, that's the labour in the machines, as the shoes are being produced, the labour in the machines is transferred to the commodity as it's being produced. As the machines, the buildings, etc., are gradually worn out, you think of the labour that was embodied in the machines and the buildings and the raw material being transferred to the finished product, and it doesn't change in amount, it's merely transferred. If now you look at Marx's pamphlet, Value, Price and Profit, it's in chapter 6, you will see how Marx spelled this out. He said, we must add to the quantity of labour last employed the quantity of labour previously worked up in the raw materials of the commodity and the labour bestowed on the implements, tools, machinery and buildings with which such labour is assisted. And it was this that Adam Smith and all these other people have overlooked. What Adam Smith was doing was looking at the last labour, the men in the pin factory, and taking no account of the labour already embodied in the factory itself and in the making the wire and all the rest of the earlier operations. In other words, they all made their calculations on the wrong assumption that all the labour required to make pins is the labour of the workers in the pin factory, and all the labour required to make shoes is the workers in the shoe factory. Whereas in both cases, most of the labour of workers who produce these things is in the materials, the machines, the fuel and so on, and not in the final operation of actually putting finishing touches, as it were, to the pins and assembling the shoes and that sort of thing in the factories. Now, it is important that you should understand the arithmetic of this if you are to see where Adam Smith went wrong and how Marx put it right. Let us assume that in the production of some commodity, the last labour, that's the labour in the pin factory or the shoe factory, is 20 hours, and the previous labour is 80 hours, so the total amount of socially necessary labour in this particular commodity is 100 hours. And let us next assume that the last labour, owing to some, I won't bring in machinery here, but assume that by reorganising the layout of the shoe factory, they're able to get 10 men to produce what was formerly took 20 men to produce. Now the last labour in that case, the 20 hours, is cut from 20 to 10. But no change has been made, you see, in the previous labour. So as far as the total labour in the commodity is concerned, we started with 100. We said 80 of it is previous, 20 of it is last. We now get a new situation where the previous labour is still 80, but the last labour is now cut from 20 to 10, so that the total labour now required to produce this particular commodity has been cut from 100 hours to 90 hours. Now that is, on those figures, the real increase of productivity is about 11%. You see, if 9 men are now producing a commodity which previously took 10 men, the output of each of them has in fact gone up by 11.1%, approximately 11%. But you see, if you do what Adam Smith and all these others have done, calculated on the last labour only and say, well look, last labour, the labour of the workers in the shoe factory, has been reduced from 20 to 10, it leads them to assume that output's been increased by 100%. It's been doubled, you see, and then which is an enormous exaggeration of what has actually happened. As I say, it will now appear that output in that case has been increased by 100%, that's to say it's been doubled, whereas in fact it hasn't. You will notice, by the way, that I assume, merely for that example, that the previous labour is 80 and the last labour is 20. It would vary according to different industries. You can have some industries in which, so to speak, the previous labour is more than 80% or is less than 80%, and in which the last labour is not 20 but 10 or 30 or 40 or anything else like this. The actual proportions differ from industry to industry, and of course what that proportion is will affect the calculation, but in every case, no matter what is the difference, the proportion between previous labour and last labour, if somebody comes along and calculates an increase in productivity on last labour alone, he's going to get the sum wrong. And this is, in fact, what they have all been doing. Now, you may wonder why Adam Smith got his calculations so enormously wrong. To start with, he had hardly any real figures. He was only guessing for a lot of his stuff. I mean, he did, in fact, go and watch some pin makers at work and was assured that their output was greater. But he didn't, I mean, see, how could Adam Smith really know how many pins a man working on his own could produce? Because, I mean, by the time he looked at a pin factory, there weren't any workers, as it were, producing pins under the condition that each man produced the pin from start to finish. But I've no doubt whatever that in 1776, when Adam Smith did this, that even in the case of pins, the previous labour was the largest part of the labour required to make pins. In other words, most of the labour required to make pins wasn't in the pin factory, it was in the metal industry, producing the metal and then the wire, to make the wire for the pin makers to use. In short, the previous labour was probably much larger than the labour in the pin factory, and Adam Smith worked his calculations solely on what he thought was happening in the pin factory. As there are now still plenty of people who believe Adam Smith's story and believe similar stories about increase in productivity, how can we be sure that they are wrong? I mean, how can we be sure that workers' output wasn't multiplied 27 times between 1770 and 1840, and that workers' output in 1950 isn't 1,000 times what it was in 1770? Now, how can we be sure, so to speak, that any of these great miscalculations are in fact miscalculations? How can we be sure, for example, that Engels was wrong in 1884 when he worked out his theory based on an enormous increase in productivity? Actually, it was Engels himself who unintentionally provided the proof that he was mistaken. If each worker's output, as Engels said, without trying to prove it, if each worker's output doubles every few years and goes on doubling every few years, you've got two possible situations. Either total production doubles every few years and unemployment remains the same, or at the other extreme, total production fails to double every few years because the market won't absorb it, in which case unemployment itself will double every few years, you see. Now, Engels declared that it was the latter that would take place. Engels said the market's not going to grow anymore, therefore if workers' output is doubling every few years, unemployment will go leaping up and go on leaping up, you see. Well, in 1884, when he made this statement, unemployment was 10%. A couple of years later, it was down to 2%. In other words, the market had increased and Engels' figures were wrong and the workers hadn't doubled their output and so on. So Engels' forecasts of total production in this country, if Engels had been right, total production in this country now would be at least 10 times what it was in 1884. Well, there are known statistics about total output which show that it simply isn't true. But I will say this for Engels. When Engels saw that things weren't moving in the way he assumed, he dropped his this notion of his and returned to Marx's idea of the periodical expansion, crisis, depression, and so on that had been going on all through the previous the century up to then. Or take the Proudhon figure that each worker in 1840 produced 27 times as much as each worker produced in 1770. There are known figures of production, imports of raw materials and exports that show that it didn't happen. Now, take, for example, the cotton industry. All the cotton used in the cotton industry was imported, and the government, for reasons of its own, kept quite precise figures of the amount of cotton imports. Well, if textile workers in 1840 were each producing 27 times as much as textile workers in 1770, and if the market expanded so that it would absorb it, then cotton imports would have had to be multiplied by 27 times. But of course the figures show that they weren't, and in other words, this simply didn't happen. Or you can look at it backwards. If each of you, in whatever job you may happen to be in, is producing 1,000 times as much as a corresponding worker was producing in 1770, then their output in 1770 is only 1,000th part of your output at the present time. Now, I don't know whatever job you may be in. I mean, I think if you look at it like this, you'll ask yourself, if that was so, how did the population in 1770 manage to feed themselves, clothe themselves, build houses and so on? And it's obvious on the face of it, it becomes absurd. I mean, take a building worker. I don't know how many hours of labour is required to produce a house now, but if you divide it by 1,000, or rather if you multiply it by 1,000 and say that in 1770 workers took 1,000 times as long, so to speak, to produce whatever they lived in, you can see that the thing just doesn't make sense.
A year, it take 1,000 years to build one house.
Yes. Engels, by the way, made that error of his 1880-40, which was in the middle of what was known at the time as the Great Depression. And the same error goes on being repeated every time there's another depression, and every time there is some technical advance in the productive machinery. Every time you get a depression, you will get this idea of being revived, about enormous increase in productivity, or every time some new technical method comes into being. See, our Engels, of course, in the 1880-40s, they were still, of course, in the mechanical stage, of the machine stage of the latter part of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, factories were still being mechanized, machinery was being introduced all the way, and it was, I suppose, fairly easy for Engels, in spite of his own knowledge of the textile industry, to assume as what he called an unheard of increase in productivity that in fact was greatly exaggerated. In the depression of the 1930s, that's, so to speak, the next big depression after the Great Depression of the 1870s, 80s, an engineer named John Hodgson published a book called The Great God Waste. He claimed that by eliminating waste, output could and would be multiplied very, very quickly by 10, He said, within a year or two, every worker will be producing 10 times as much as he is now, because, having read my book, manufacturers will see how they can eliminate waste, and that will be the result of it. The cult word at that time, by the way, was rationalization. This process was called rationalization. All industry was going to be rationalized. And redundant workers were all going to be got rid of, output would be increased, and all the rest of it, you see. You will not be surprised to learn that almost on the first page of Hodgson's book, The Great God Waste, he reproduces the story of Adam Smith's pinmakers, just to prove his case, you see. But he gave others of his own. He mentioned, for example, brick-making plants which enable one man to produce many thousands of bricks each day. And like Adam Smith, Hodgson, again, gave no thought whatever to previous labour. See, he looked at his Adam Smith pin makers, and he looked at his brick-making plants, and he could see that perhaps you might have had 100 men working in a brick-making plant without any elaborate machinery. A machine comes along which displaces a lot of these men, and then Hodgson says, look, each man's now producing thousands of bricks a day, but taking no account of the previous labour in the making of the bricks, including the new machinery that was being installed. Then another engineer, Major Douglas, came along about the same time. He was the founder of the social credit movement. He joined this bandwagon. He claimed that there was a flaw in the monetary system of capitalism, and that you only had to remove this monetary flaw, in effect print more money, that the enormous potential power of productivity would be released. Douglas, by the way, was unaware that his ideas had been discovered or invented a century before by John Gray in 1848, who called it the underproduction of money. Of course, Gray and Douglas were quite wrong. Printing more money, of course, doesn't release a terrific increase in powers of production. Douglas prophesied the imminent collapse of capitalism because of this enormous increase in productivity that was going to take place. And one of Douglas's lieutenants was so convinced about it that he wrote an open letter to the Labour Party saying, look, you realise you've got to change your name. It's no use calling yourself the Labour Party because within a few years there won't be any labourers. They'll all be out of work. Or 90% of them will be out of work. You'll have to find another name for yourself. Things didn't happen like this. There wasn't any enormous increase in productivity. And after the war, in the 50s, we got the same fallacy about productivity came up this time not through unemployment but with the discovery of nuclear energy. Because the number of workers employed in a nuclear energy power plant is relatively small, in other words, the investment in constant capital is enormous and the number of workers employed is very, very small, they again assumed they miscalculated production, and we were told at the time that atomic power would be so cheap that it would simply sweep coal and gas and conventional electric power plants and hydraulic power plants, sweep them right away, and everything within a few years would be run by atomic energy, simply because the productivity was so enormous and it was so cheap. Well, now 30 years later you will see that in fact, in spite of the enormous increase in the cost of oil, for example, that atomic power is only just beginning to come in, and it is not being particularly cheap. I mean, it's maybe a little cheaper at present than oil-fired power stations, but I mean, there's very little in it. In other words, all these calculations were wrong then. Then, 20-odd years ago, we got another wave of it. Again, it wasn't due to unemployment. This was automation and computers. Again, people made their calculations about productivity on last labour only, and didn't take into account the previous labour, as Marx said they ought to and must. And there was, for example, a conference in America on automation and unemployment, run by trade union officials and professional economists. One of the things they produced a lot of information of this kind. One of their cases was, they said, with an automated plant, and I quote, one worker produces as much goods as 100 or more workers were able to produce before the plant was set up, taking no account whatever of the enormous cost of this automated plant, and of course, again, not making their calculations on total labour, but on last labour only. And in 1963, they were rash enough to forecast. They said we can, in the next decade, learn to produce all the goods we need in the United States with 2% of the working population. Well, the decade after 1963 is 1973, so according to their forecast, by 1973, 98% of the American workers would have been out of work. Well, it actually turned out to be 6%, and the people who made the prophecy, I suppose, got busy on making prophecies of some other kind, but the thing faded away. And again, it's an example of the failure to understand the problem of productivity and how you calculate it. Now, of course, we're getting a new wave of this with the silicon chip, or as I read in my Daily Mail a couple of days ago, the silicon chip is already on the way out, being replaced by something else. What is it? But a book was recently published by Clive Jenkins, a trade union official, and a man named Barry Sherman, called The Collapse of Work, in which they forecast, just as Engels did in 1884 and the Hodgson did in the 1930s and the other people with automation and computers, they forecast that work will rapidly disappear. There'll be no need for it at all, and there'll be an enormous increase in productivity and in unemployment. And the curious thing is that they themselves notice, and they say so, that converting industry to silicon chips and bottling in all these products will require a huge investment of capital. But again, they make their calculations without either taking into account this huge investment of capital, and again without realizing that they've got to work their percentage increase on the basis of the whole of the labour and not just on the final parts of it. We will in fact have to wait several years before you'll see what sort of effect this has had on productivity. My guess would be that you can expect a fairly big increase in productivity in the next few years for that and more particularly for other reasons, but that when you realise how small is the annual rate of increase in productivity, you see you're not dealing with some enormous problem, but a relatively small one. I want now to deal with two particular aspects of this. They're agriculture and coal mining, to illustrate Marx's method of calculating productivity. The agricultural industry, say back in 1900, both here in America and anywhere else, was almost a totally self-supporting industry. All the labour required to produce food existed on the farms themselves. Apart from a certain small quantity of iron for ploughs, for example, all the labour of men and horses and the materials used in farming existed on the farm themselves. In other words, for all practical purposes, agriculture was a closed industry. It had all its raw materials produced within its own circle, so that all the labour required to produce agricultural goods, apart from ploughs, was done on the farm itself. Now, while that continued to be true, it was a simple matter to measure the productivity in agriculture and its increase. All you had to do was to get each year the total quantity of wheat and other things produced on farms and see if it increased from year to year, and divide it by the number of working farmers and farm workers employed on farms. You divided the two and you got an answer. If you found, for example, that the total manpower didn't increase, but the total output went up by 5%, then you could say that's a 5% increase in average output of the people on the farms. But of course that self-sufficiently no longer exists. Agriculture now is enormously dependent on materials brought in onto the farms from outside. Fertilizers, weed killers, coal, electricity, oil, machinery, etc. Farms, in other words, are no longer self-contained. They're now working with materials and absorbing the labour in all these materials. Now, a large part, and probably the major part of the labour required to produce wheat and other things on farms doesn't exist on the farms themselves. It exists outside the farms. Figures produced by the British Government Statistical Office for 1968 showed that against a total output for British agriculture of 1892 million, the input of materials, fertilizers, electricity, machinery, steel, all the rest of it, was 1051 million, that is 55%. In other words, more than half the labour now required to produce farm products doesn't exist on the farms itself. It's previous labour that's embodied in these things before they ever get onto the farms to enable the farms to produce their wheat and so on. Or put another way, more than half the farm workers now don't work on farms. They work in the oil industry, the electricity industry, the engineering industry, and in particular in the chemical factories producing fertilizers and so on for use in the farms. And you can see what a mess the people have got into who still use Adam Smith's defective method of calculation and don't allow for what Marx called previous labour in calculating the amount of labour required to produce a commodity. For some years now, some figures have been circulating in America and this country about the supposed enormous increase in agricultural output. They were used in this country in a Reith lecture by the head of Elliott Automation Company. He quoted the figures, and as far as I know, nobody took him up on it. It goes like this. So great is farm productivity that one man on the farm is able to support 15 men in the towns. That's how it was put in America, you see. The people working on farms has in fact declined, and they compare the number of workers on farms with the number of workers working in industry and in the town. So they say, so great is farm productivity that one man on a farm can support 15 men in the towns. Now, you see, if the argument were true, you can reverse it. And if you reverse it, this is what you get. So low is the productivity of men in the towns that it takes 15 men in the town to support one man on a farm. I mean, they're both often absurd, but one is as true or untrue as the other. And they're both, you see, only half-truths because they don't take any notice of what has happened to agriculture. That agriculture is no longer a self-contained industry, but is one in which bulk of the labour for farm products is previous labour that takes place before the chemicals and all the rest of it get onto the farms. The other example is coal mining, which is interesting for the same reason, but also for a different one. Coal mining used to be a self-contained industry. I suppose 100 years ago, there was practically no machinery of any kind used on farms except possibly some rather simple pumping arrangements, and they were comparatively simple. But all miners needed to start a mine, because coal was near the surface, were picks and shovels and pickpots, a few things like that. But another thing that's happened with coal that hasn't happened in the same way with agriculture, and that is that in the last 100 years, not only has coal ceased to be a self-contained industry, but that the coal has become more and more difficult to mine. Coal seams, all the ones near the surface have been more used up, and they have to go deeper and deeper, a couple of miles down, and then sometimes 3 miles underground, actually to get at the coal seams. So that more and more labour is going to be required to produce a ton of deep mine coal anyway, for that reason. Now, contrasted with what happened 100 years ago, when some men could get together and start a mine, provided they got permission, of course, from the man who owned the land, but they could start a mine with picks and shovels and just clear off the top soil and start digging it. There's a mine coming into use now in Yorkshire, Selby mine. They've been working on it for about 5 years. They haven't mined a single ton of coal from it, but they've spent £600 million preparing this mine to come into use. Now you see, here you get an example of an enormous investment of capital required to start a mine, but in addition, of course, now the mining industry, like the agricultural industry, is enormously dependent on machinery produced outside and brought into the mines, on electric power, oil power, and all sorts of other things without which the mining industry cannot now be carried on. But so little is this understood that Gormley, the miners' leader, recently made a statement that the productivity in the coal industry is so great that coal miners ought to have a 1-day week instead of a 5-day week. Of course, good luck to Gormley and the miners' union if they can get their hours of work reduced. But I'm quite sure that when Gormley goes along to the coal board and says, look, you know, we're producing 5 times as much as we were 2 years ago, reduce our hours from 5 days a week to 1 day a week, you know, just 6 days work, 1 day a week, you see. I'm sure you'll get a dusty answer. But I know where Gormley's got this from, and he's got it from the fact that the government's own statistical office is still doing what Adam Smith was doing in 1776. The statistical office produces an index of what they call output per worker in mining and quarrying. Quarrying is only a small part of it. Essentially, it's the output of miners. And it shows that output per miner increased between 1975 and 1978 by 132%, that is to say, much more than doubled in 3 years. Well, you see, if this were really true, Gormley's only got to wait another couple of years to 1981, when in fact he will be able to go back to the coal board and say, look, miners' output is now 5 times what it was in 1975, so you cut our hours from 5 days a week to 1 day a week. You see, but of course the thing is completely wrong. The government department, which is calculating these things, is calculating it on the basis of taking total output from the mines, including open cast collieries, and dividing it by the number of workers who work in the pits, and taking no account of the miners, so to speak, who no longer work in pits, but who work in the oil industry, the electricity industry, the engineering industry, and all these other ancillary things which are putting labour into the materials before they even get into the mines. It's I suppose sooner or later someone will point out to the government statistical department. I mean, the coal board themselves will. The coal board will go to the statistical department and say, look, you're causing a lot of trouble. You produce these figures, and our miners want their hours cut from 5 days to 1 day a week. And it may get them to think about it. But in fact, when I quoted some earlier figures about the input and output of agriculture, another department of the government statistical office produces them, and it looks to me as if they have begun to get wise to this thing. In other words, they're now looking at each industry and not looking merely at the workers employed in it, but looking at the extent to which it is itself dependent on goods which embody labour outside that particular industry. Now, you want to be clear about Marx's formula for calculating productivity and its increase. As I've already said, you can't just look at the last labour, you've got to look at the whole labour, including the previous labour. Or to put it in another way, the real increase in productivity is the difference between the saving of last labour and whatever an increase there may be in previous labour. Suppose, for example, that a machine enables an employer to get rid of 10 workers, but that the machine itself and its operation require an additional 5 workers. The saving isn't 10 workers, it's 5 workers. The difference between 10 and 5. Looking at this question of machinery and unemployment, initially, of course, every time a labour-saving machine is introduced, it creates some unemployment. But the ultimate effect depends not merely on how much labour is displaced by the machine, but as Marx pointed out, you've got to look also at the extent to which additional capital is being invested. And as he put it, if capital is being invested fast enough, it can absorb not only the workers displaced by the machine, but additional workers as well, until such time as the market won't absorb the goods. Marx used a particular example. He talked about a mill, presumably a textile mill, where they introduced labour-saving machinery, you see, and a certain number of workers are got rid of. Well, as Marx pointed out, if for some reason or other, an increase in the demand, capitalists come along and build 2 mills or 3 mills, then the total number of workers employed in the 3 mills will be greater than the number who were previously employed in 1 mill, even although machines have enabled each mill to get rid of a certain number of workers. I mean, and this is the way the thing presents itself. Now, having dealt with the errors of Adam Smith and others and explained Marx's method of measuring the real increase in productivity, the question arises, to what extent have workers shared in increased productivity under capitalism? It's difficult, of course, to make calculations, particularly about the average increase in productivity for the whole working class. But indirectly, it is possible to get an approximate idea by what the statisticians do, measuring total production for the country as a whole, which is itself a very difficult thing, and then dividing it by the working population. It's only approximate because at some times a larger proportion of the population are actually working than at other times. See, since the war, some millions of married women have come into industry who weren't there in the 1930s, but allowing for things like that, you can get a rough idea that between 1870 and 1913, output per head was increasing at about 1.25% a year cumulatively. Like each year was about 1.25% above the previous year. It doesn't actually work out, from year to year. There may be periods in which it doesn't increase at all and other periods where it increases a bit more. And between 1938 and 1979, it appears that output has been increasing at about 2% a year. And my guess will be that you might expect when the next expansion comes along that it may go up to something like 2.5% a year, which relatively, of course, will be quite a big increase. One thing you have to beware of if you're looking for information about this, you want to allow for the effect of inflation. Every year, for example, the government publishes figures of gross domestic product and national income which are on current prices, and they don't mean a thing. Expressed in that form, like the money represented by total output this year as compared to previous years, if you look at those figures, it will look as if output last year was about 40 times what it was in 1900. But nearly all of that, the greater part of it, is merely the increase in prices. For example, if the price of coal goes up from £15 a tonne to £30 a tonne, you've still only got one tonne of coal. You haven't increased in real terms, you haven't increased anything. But the government also does calculate some figures in what they call constant prices. In other words, they discount the effect of a mere increase in prices and try to get a figure which does, in fact, more or less accurately represent what is going on. I say more or less accurately because it's a very difficult and complicated calculation. It may be a simple matter, for example, for the authorities to calculate each year how many tons of coal are produced. And, no particular problem arises in that. But you think of the difficulty of measuring the output of machinery when you've got hundreds or thousands of different types of machines, and where the machines themselves the types are changing, new ones are coming along every year. It becomes enormously difficult, and these people have worked out various ways, as I say, of getting a more or less accurate picture of what's going on. Or imagine the difficulty of measuring total output of hundreds of, thousands of different food products, tinned and packaged and all the rest of it, which themselves are changing every year. New ones, every month, new ones are coming on the market and old ones disappearing. Well, they try to solve problems like this. And just one last one for you to think about. Imagine trying to measure the output of forestry workers year by year. They obviously have got some sort of answer, I don't know what it is, but it's an exceedingly difficult thing to conceive of. How do you measure the rate at which trees are growing, for example? And it's not sufficient to say you measure it by the amount of timber that's cut down and sold, because this may depend on all sorts of things. For example, in both world wars, they've cut down enormous areas of forestry, you see, because they wanted timber for war purposes. Well, if you looked at, if they calculated output by the amount of timber that's trees that are cut down and timber that's sold, it would seem as if output of forestry workers enormously increased during the war, and since then has diminished to almost nothing. So anyway, these are problems that they have to try to get over. I did mention, and I'm coming to it now, to what extent do workers share in increased productivity? There have been people, Ferdinand Lassalle was one of them, who took the view, and I suppose it's broadly true that Marx and Engels in their very early days were thinking in these terms. They thought that the workers tended to live on a bare subsistence minimum, that they never really would get above it. Well, you see, if workers, as Lassalle thought, always lived on a bare physical minimum, and if their output was constantly increasing, the logic of this would be that the only people who gain from increased productivity are the capitalists, because they get the whole of it. The workers get nothing out of it. And Marx pointed out in his day that the capitalists were still making that claim. The capitalists were still saying to the workers, look, increased productivity doesn't belong to you, it belongs to us. It's the result of our investment in machinery and things like these. It's ours, you see. Well, Marx said, of course, the workers and trade unions challenged this, and tried to dispute it to get at least a share out of it. And it's quite obvious, I mean, I don't need to go into any figures, you think of it yourself, that the workers have succeeded in doing this. I mean, just compare like the standard of living of workers now with what it was described by Engels in 1844 in his Condition of the English Workers in 1844. Or make a comparison with the present time and say 1914, something like this. It's quite obvious that the workers have succeeded in getting at least a share out of the increased productivity. Now we come to wind up the question of productivity under socialism. The major difference between production under capitalism and under socialism will be, of course, that when socialism is established, you will be able, so to speak, at a stroke, to get rid of all the destruction and waste of capitalism. All the armaments and the unnecessary bureaucracy and the banking and insurance and all these sorts of things. In the early days of the party, figures were used in party pamphlets which showed, I mean, it was a fairly simple sort of calculation, that the production of goods and services useful to society could be doubled by with the introduction of socialism. In other words, all the people who were not working at all, the able-bodied people who were not working, and the people working away in insurance and banking and armaments and the army and so on, would be released, and their labour could be added to the labour available for producing useful goods and services, and that quite easily output could be doubled. Among other things, of course, you'd get rid of the restrictive practices of employers and trade unions, both employers who on some occasions tried to prevent some dangerous new product coming on the market, and workers, of course, who tried to protect their jobs by maintaining overmanning in industry, which, of course, is a normal practice of trade unions wherever they think they can do it. One other thing that I suggest will also mark a difference. Marx pointed out that in every depression, enormous amount of capital equipment is destroyed. I mean, it's junked and sold for scrap. Firms go bankrupt. Well, you can't imagine that sort of thing happening under socialism. Incidentally, I don't even think, although some people have made this a sort of assumption, that in socialist society will always want the latest possible techniques of production used. But you see, using the latest techniques of production means scrapping the existing ones long before their useful life's been worked out. So anyway, if you reckon that, as again is true now, that society could simply easily double the output of useful goods and services, and for the time being at any rate be able to rely on an annual increase, 2, 3 or 4%, something like this, it's quite easy to see that the situation will exist, as Marx pointed out, when the whole of the human race will be able to live decently and humanly under acceptable working conditions.
It's about the oil. I remember just around in the Second World War, when Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable acted that picture town. In 1917, apparently, what they call a wildcatter, if he went out prospecting for oil, he might have got it because it was shallow. But today, they've got to go down so far. And in what Russia say, they find it more difficult getting oil. They've got to go further north, and apparently they've got to go further down too.
Well, I mean, this is generally true of what they call the extractive industries. In other words, you've got two forces at work. You've got productivity itself, as it were, increasing, but it's up against the fact that in the extractive industries, more often than not, you've already used up the easily accessible stuff, and you've got to go deeper and further for it.
I think David McNee the Metropolitan Police made a statement a few months ago saying that proportionately less money is being spent on the police now than was spent 50 years ago. But I think that's true as far as the figures go. But of course, 50 years ago, money wasn't spent on police computers and making, radios for them to carry around and panda cars and all of these things. So I suppose that's another example. It's wasteful productivity anyway, but it's an example of the same thing. Are there any other?
Can you think, of anything you remarked, about the agriculture? And I think I heard you say, that in America, somehow or the other, you see that in making the comparisons, that there was such a thing as labour saving, you see, not in the sense that you mean it, regarding that you take everything as a whole into it. Workers in the field of agriculture, in proportion there was a saving there. Say they actually reduced, the workers there. Can you think of anything else, any other industry where there was a saving?
Well, I mean, in all industries, nearly all machinery that's introduced is introduced in order to displace workers, the saving of labour.
Yes, but
and
as a whole, I'm talking about...
Well, in most industries...
everything is taken into consideration. I'm talking about, as you remarked, you see, you've got workers who are making, agricultural machinery, all that is taken into consideration. Where is the saving in labour there?
Well, I mean, the point is that there is ever so much more machinery now used than there was 50 or 100 years ago, and it's through the machinery that they're able to raise output. In other words, they're able to get the same output with fewer workers, after allowing both for the labour in the machine as set against the labour that's saved. So, generally speaking, over the whole field, when I say that production's increasing about 2% a year, this is calculated on, they're calculated on the whole of the workers in this country, the whole 23 million of them, taking all industries. So you'll get some industries where, in fact, productivity may be falling, or you may get manufacturing industries where it's rising fairly fast, and some other non-manufacturing industries where it's only rising slowly. But spread over the whole 23 million, you can reckon that output's been increasing at about 2% a year, something like that. I mean, there are some industries, of course, where not only very difficult to calculate it, but where obviously output doesn't increase. I mean, deep mine coal is one of them.
What about the position of the motor industry, where Leyland are in the red, they're not making any money apparently, or so they say, or very little, and yet the Ford Motor Company, in the same industry, in the same country, has turned out the biggest ever profit and has probably produced more cars than ever before in their particular history, in the Ford, British Ford production units. I mean, this would want some calculation on productivity.
Well, see, whether it's due to that, it may be due to something else. I don't know. It may be due to the fact that Ford is managed by people in America who've chosen more wisely than the people in this country, particularly because in British Leyland, of course, where trade unions are very strong, and you've had a Labour government which has in effect resisted the modernisation of British Leyland. I do know that, I'm speaking from memory, I think it was over a period of about 1948 to 1970, the figures were published here of the total output of cars in this country and the total number of workers, and strange as it may seem, the number of cars was increasing less fast than the number of workers. Of course, the management of British Leyland and so on, yes, they'd say it's just overmanning and we can't do anything about it. In which case, of course, they're being pushed out now.
There is one other thing. I don't know whether you've got any other views on the motor car industry. I don't really know. But there is something else that about productivity of agriculture that's particularly worth bearing in mind. Not only was agriculture 100 years ago or at the beginning of the century self-contained, but what processing of food took place at all was on the farms. In other words, they did various things like with hams and things like this, and if there was any grading of things or of fruits and so on, they did it on the farms. Well, now you see, it isn't done on the farms, it's done in an enormous food processing industry outside the farms. So, in a sense now, food used to be produced on farms. Now, it isn't even produced on farms, it's produced on farms and in these food factories. They are doing the processing. And of course, the health regulations come into this. Under various health regulations, labour, so to speak, is being used that wasn't being used 50, 100 years ago. I mean, I know I can remember using milking machines back in 1918, and all we did with the milk, we cooled it and sent it straight off. It was being sold in Brighton 3 or 4 hours later. Now, of course, there are all sorts of regulations I have to go through about purifying the milk and protecting it against all sorts of things. But, in other words, absorbing more labour required to do it.
Yeah. Well, I always remember when there was a factory in an agriculture area, they would call it production of agriculture.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I've got a question which directly relates to the talk. Taking production and capitalism, working class across the world, taken as a whole, produce more wealth than they consume, and the difference between what they actually consume and what they produce presumably could be divided up into various categories, such as the individual consumption of capitalists through unearned incomes, in other words, consuming things they haven't got to produce. The production of wealth in the form of military armaments and so on, to serve the interests of the capitalist class. Obviously that accounts for a great deal of the surplus wealth. And I'm not sure how else what other categories you could analyse there, but would it be true to say that in socialism, or sorry, I should have said the third category that I was trying to think of, that was, of course, accumulated labour in the form of capital itself. But is it true to say that in socialism, whereas the first two categories I referred to obviously won't exist in any form whatsoever, the third category, as far as a surplus is concerned, will exist under a new form, insofar as a whole, we will still be producing more than we consume. I appreciate that the surplus won't be the property of capitalists and employing class. It will be, what I'm getting at is that the wealth won't be entirely consumed, obviously. We'll still be wanting to create a certain amount of wealth in the form of machinery, and therefore there'll still be that.
It'd be for society to decide how much it wants out of this sort of thing. I mean, society could, of course, aim at a stable population and a stable output if they really wanted to do it. But, in the simplest form, of course, if you grow wheat, you can't consume all the wheat in the year in which you grow it. If you do, you won't have any seed for sowing wheat next year. And, of course, enormous amount of it now gets absorbed in roads and hospitals and schools and things like this, and society will still need these things. So you don't have to think of it in terms of there being any surplus, as it were. It's simply that if you're going to live at all, you must have reserves to fall back on. I mean, you may still get devastating harvest failures under socialism. And you'll have to have a reserve to fall back on to meet this situation.
So that there will still be a difference between what we consume and what we produce?
Oh, well, there must be. I mean, there always was, so to speak. Since men have ever lived, they've had to. They can't eat everything that they produce immediately. While they're waiting for the next harvest, they've still got to have something while they're waiting for the next harvest to come out.
So doesn't it really just boil down to who has control over that discrepancy between what you're consuming and what you're producing? In other words, the point is it won't be monopolised by a possessive class.
Well, there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, in socialist society, you won't have industry being run by people appointed by the capitalists. Society itself will have control of all these things.
Presumably, the surplus will be consumed eventually.
Well, yeah. Well, it'll be consumed eventually, yes. But I mean, you can't consume it immediately, so to speak.
But machinery is consumed. I mean, I don't think you can make a difference in any consumer goods and any other in context of socialism. The difference is that where you have privately owned capital or state-owned capital, then you've got a class that is not something you can transfer into the context of a socialist society. It's not. If you have production for need, then the tools of production will only be part of need, and as they wear away, they will be part of the consumption. They will be part of the product of the machinery as well. So it's not true to say there'll be a surplus over and above consumption as far as I'm concerned. I would say there might be in a practical sense if you talk about things like wheat or something like that, but I think it's dangerous to talk about, consumption itself only has a meaning within a capitalist society, or at least a private property society. Other than that, all production is part of consumption, because otherwise the term production for human needs wouldn't have any meaning.
I think you've got to...
The point is, of course, that you can't consume it immediately.
Right.
You can't consume everything immediately.
But in what way, in socialism, can machines be consumed, so to speak, if they're not now? In what way are they...
Same way as they are now.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. In what way are they going to be consumed then, but they're not now?
Well, they wear out.
They're not consumed now.
No, there is a difference, because a lot of machinery now is destroyed. It's not allowed to wear out.
See, I think you've got to make a distinction in this term surplus. The surpluses that they're talking about, particularly these arguments you get about the common market, which are right on our doorstep, they're surpluses which are surplus to the market. And I mean, they're surpluses which exist despite the fact that, as Comrade Hardy has pointed out, 1,500 million people are going short, and some of them are actually starving to death. So that kind of surplus would not exist. I could imagine a surplus of wheat existing, even above requirements that have been calculated far into the future, but you won't have that existing alongside of people going short. It's quite possible that you would have to, in that case, socialist society would have to reorganise their production in that particular particular use that's required. But I think the word surplus is a word that's particular to market economy.
Yes, what I'd like to say, you mentioned about 1900 everything done on the farm. Well, outside the farm would be mostly the government be doing it. There's experimental farms, breeding wheat, because they've got to keep this mutation wheat, they've got to keep breeding it. And then they've got to try to breed a strain that can resist rust. Might be tape or might be some other sort of a disease what wheat gets. But that has to be done on the outside for seed.
On this question about, so to speak, the question you raised, one thing you do have to remember, that you'll get figures that are published both for America and Argentina and for the world as a whole about stocks of wheat that exist. And people sometimes treat this as if the stocks of wheat are all surplus to market requirements. But you see, they're not.